Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Manchester is Red podcast, counting down the days towards the end of the Ruud van Nistelrooy era. We're recording this on a Friday morning after Van Nistelrooy's first European win as United's interim manager. United beating PAOK 2-0 on Thursday night. I'm Tyrone Marshall hosting today, joined by Samuel Luckhurst. Samuel, how are we?
Very well since I last saw you, probably less than 12 hours ago, wasn't it, or something like that. And then we're seeing each other again in about just over 2.5 hours, or more or less, I think it is. So yeah, seeing more of each other than our wives, I think, the way it's going at the moment. Exactly
what I was just about to say. Yes. Seeing, with all due respect, seeing you too often, Samuel, I think it would be fair to say. But yeah. It's good to see you back anyway. And yes, I mean, we saw each other last night in what felt like a pretty forgettable game, wasn't it? And it was a game that was only enlivened by Amad. It was Amad's world last night, and we were all living in it. And thank God he was there, because without him, that would have been, I think you used the word drudgery at halftime, and that was pretty apt. It was a bad game lit up by the brilliance of one man who was so far above the rest of the players on both teams, wasn't he?
Well, during the first half, I said, like, who are these idiots wandering around? And you said, oh, that's the players. And I was, of course, referring to some tourists who didn't know where their seats were about half an hour into the game. And at the weekend, there were some idiots who actually couldn't find their seats and ended up coming into the press box. And I mean, some of the characters you see at Old Trafford. But anyway, it was, I mean, we're probably going to toss a coin as to whose intro that was. Had the game actually ended 0-0, I think it should have been yours, given that you came up with the remark. But it really did sum up that first half, which was just unwatchable. I think if I wasn't working, I was at home, I probably wouldn't have watched that game. There's not a lot about those matches that set the pulses racing. And Amad was by far and away the best player in the first half. He made a little error right at the end of it, which was, I think, the final act before the referee blew for halftime. And we said just before halftime that sometimes referees in the Europa League, certainly at this stage, they take mercy on you because they don't add any added time on. They just blow for the whistle as soon as it hits the 45-minute mark, just to put everyone out of their misery. And unfortunately, we had one more minute of it last night, and it was just a torturous half. Fortunately, the second half absolutely flew by, thanks to one man. I remember you saying, like, how is this? How are we into the 72nd minute here? And I thought, crikey, that's a positive. Like, you know, at least time did fly. Whilst we were having fun, given that you know, the second half was a lot more watchable, and it was down to one player, and that reflected really well on Van Nistelrooy, because Amad in for Rashford was the only change to the attack. Amad was making his first start in 7 games, his first start in 5 weeks. He hadn't started since that Porto game. It was, you know, it reflected well on Van Nistelrooy in that he's put a player back into the team who's come up with 2 goals. I thought Amad was pretty bright last week as well, with his cameos. He did genuinely look, I know he looks quite happy most of the time anyway, but he did look happier to be playing under Van Nistelrooy. And there was an element of purpose against Leicester when he came on, and also maybe to a lesser extent Chelsea. And then he pops up with 2 goals to get United their first European win in 380 days. So that ends that rot. So it was a good night for the player. It was a good night for Van Nistelrooy, coming 2 weeks, in Amad's case, after Ten Hag very peculiarly said that Anthony had to come on ahead of Amad against Fenerbahce because of his training form. And God knows what Ten Hag was seeing in training. You know, I think that might have accounted for a lot of things that he was saying towards the end of his time at United. But objectively, Amad is a far better right-sided player than Anthony. And I suppose his performance, it kind of had a bearing on 3 different managers. It was a resounding response to what Ten Hag said the other week. It was a ringing endorsement for Van Nistelrooy's man management, his selection, and also for Ruben Amorim. I think Amad is a player who has attributes that absolutely do fit into his system, whether that's as a wide player in that midfield 4, which is where I think he should be at least trialled initially, or as one of the three forwards, where United will have to work on what's the best triangle to go with under Amorim. They have got quite a few options there, which does bode well, albeit some of those options are pretty underwhelming, and you can whittle that list down to maybe 4 or 5 players at the maximum. But whether it's as a wide player or one of those three, Amad is absolutely in the conversation, and it was a very, very good night for him, and just a pity for him that it ended with his enforced removal through injury.
Yeah, absolutely. There certainly looked to be the frustration at not playing included in that performance. I mean, he was United's best player by a distance in the first half as well. I thought there was that moment he sprinted across the pitch to press 3 different PAOK players. I mean, he spoke in the mix zone afterwards, and he was there with a beaming smile, but he can be relatively shy, and he did suggest that it wasn't based around kind of that frustration. He just puts his all into every performance, and he certainly did that. I mean, let's talk about the goals. The first, I mean, for a player who I think is 5'7", he's now scored 2 inventive headers for Manchester United at Old Trafford. The back header against AC Milan, I think his first goal for the club, and this one, I mean, quite a strange goal to watch, the way he sort of looped the header back, but well taken. And it kind of sums him up that he is quite an inventive player and finds solutions to problems sometimes that he's faced with on the pitch. And then the second goal, I mean, I think I said to you at the time that it struck me as a goal that Amorim would love, in that he created that goal himself by winning the ball back, and he pressed Baba Rahman so aggressively and so intensely that in the end, Rahman, just had no answer to it. He just coughed the ball straight up to Amad, who drove at goal and scored brilliantly. And it was 2 excellent goals. And that's what United need as well, isn't it? Because we've spoken constantly about the lack of goals in this team. It was another night where it never really looked like happening for Højlund. So to see Amad kind of showing those solutions was big. And the goals said a lot about his own game and his own strengths, didn't they?
They did. Those 2 headers, eerily, they're both reminiscent of headers scored by former United players. The Milan one drew a lot. Certainly, I saw it and thought of Javier Hernandez scoring a very inventive header against Stoke in one of his first games for United, and the one last night was very reminiscent of Darren Fletcher's at the same end against Chelsea in November 2005. It might have been close to 19 years to the day, in fact. Which was up that end as well, similar type of ball in. There was one angle last night that suggested that maybe he was actually looking for Højlund, and that would account for the header dropping in the way it did. I think you've still got to give him credit. Like it was a good header, whether he was trying to find Højlund or the fact that he was actually trying to find the back of the net because he got the desired outcome. I didn't realise until I watched a little bit of the highlights when I got in last night. I say a little bit, it was literally the 3-minute version. I wasn't going to sit through a 90-minute rerun of it, and I didn't realise that his second goal was it took a minor deflection. It might not have changed the trajectory of the ball too much, but there was a slight deviation on the flight of the ball. But it was still, I mean, we had a good view of it. The press box is up that end of the ground, and he caught it well. I think it was certainly on target. In fact, I don't think it certainly was on target. And it was all about the purpose in his game, the fact that he won the ball. He had one thing on his mind. There were many reasons why he's a better footballer than Antony, but one of the key ones is that he is direct and he's quick. He gets on the ball. He wants to do something with it. Won't always work, but there's an element of that with most wingers. You have to have that patience with them. But from start to finish last night, he was really impressive. He should have had a penalty in the first half as well. Thought that was a really poor decision from the on-pitch referee, and then the VAR who actually did review it, and it certainly wasn't a corner, which was the outcome the referee came to, and there was clear contact. It was a foul. So he was in the thick of it. He should have had a penalty, got 2 goals. That pressing in the first half, I think it was shortly after he was denied the penalty, where he elicited a roar from the Stretford end. He's been a fan's favourite for quite some time. He's pretty much a cult hero there because of the Liverpool goal in the FA Cup in March. And looking at that team last night, there probably couldn't have been a more popular goal scorer for the crowd because he is likeable. he's been there a longer time than people might think. Our colleague who asked I think there were 4 questions or 3 questions on Amad in the press conference afterwards, and a colleague said he's been at the club for 3.5 years now, or nearly 3.5 years. He's actually been there for nearly 4.5 years. It was October 2020 that he arrived, and I don't know what his appearance figure is exactly, but it must be in the 20s at the very most. I can't imagine he's broken anywhere near into the 30s. And in terms of starts that he's had for United, he'll still be in single figures. So his development has been a slow burner, and there are a number of reasons for that. He had 2 ill-timed injuries just before he was due to go on loan to Feyenoord in 2021. Then, of course, last year on pre-season against Arsenal in New Jersey, he had a very good season on loan at Sunderland. He didn't have a great time on loan at Rangers in the second half of the 21-22 season. He only got going in the second half of last season because of that knee injury he had. He had 5 months of his career wiped off from that. But what I thought was a little bit peculiar, certainly at the end of last season, was that when, certainly in the case for Ten Hag, it was his work with youngsters, and absolutely that was the case with Garnacho and Mainu. But Amad was getting bracketed in there somehow, and it was almost as if people didn't realise that, one, he's not a United Academy player, but also Ten Hag was almost pretty much railroaded into playing him, because he sent him out on loan the previous season. Certainly, had he not got injured during pre-season 2023, I think it was a toss of a coin as to whether Amad was going to go on loan or Facundo Pellistri was going to go on loan. Ten Hag never seemed that convinced. He played Amari Forson ahead of him against Fulham earlier this year. He didn't start him in a Premier League match until May. And then this season, Amad played very well against Southampton one week, didn't play as well against Crystal Palace the next week, and then he's out of the team and he barely had to start again under Ten Hag. He did very well in pre-season as well, but his progression at United, it doesn't feel like that's something that you can give Ten Hag the kudos for. He was turning to him whenever United weren't winning in games to bring him on as an impact sub, and he took his time to actually start him. With Mainu and Garnacho, absolutely, they are his academy legacies at United. He did a brilliant job with both of those players. But I thought it was a bit rich for people to say, oh, Amad's another youngster who he's done a really good job with. Strangely, Van Nistelrooy maybe deserves more credit than any manager who has managed Amad at United. And he's had 4 managers, technically. He's played under Solskjaer, very briefly, Ralf Rangnick, Ten Hag, and now Van Nistelrooy. And it seems in a perverse way, even though he's only, 12 days in of his interim tenure, Van Nistelrooy has maybe been the most trusting, and he's only started him once. But I suppose it's the John Murtough legacy. He was probably the one who championed Amad more than anyone else. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, he was signed during Solskjaer's time. I don't think many of us consider him a genuine Solskjaer signing. He had one kickabout under Rangnick before he was off to Rangers on loan. Ten Hag, as I said, started Amari Forson over him, and one of the last things he said was that Anthony's training form is why he brought him on ahead of Amad against Fenerbahce. But Van Nistelrooy spoke very glowingly and articulately about him last night. It was interesting to hear what he said about Amad wanting to do extra sessions after training, wanting to work on one-on-ones, crossing, finishing. He did a press conference during pre-season that he came across as a really good, grounded young professional, and it's absolutely in United's interest to tie him down on a long-term contract. You would think, if you're Amorim, certainly, that he's a player that you would at the very least want in your squad going forward.
Yeah, you touched on this before then, but let's talk about it again. Where does he fit under Amorim? Because I think this is a conversation we're having with so many players at the moment. And it's all kind of based on the presumption that Amorim will stick to that back three that he uses so often. And I mean, given how wedded he seems to it, I think it's a fair assumption at the moment. I mean, it depends a lot on whether he sees any of those wingers as a wing back, I guess. But But other than that, I was saying to someone last night, you kind of look at how he plays it at the moment. He played it on Tuesday, and you're going to have Højlund as the number 9. Fernandes is going to be one of the number 10s. And then you're basically picking 1 from 3 with Amad, Garnacho and Rashford, which is, I mean, probably, you don't have a lot of games, but they're 3 of your better attacking players, I would say. So it's going to be interesting to see, as Amad jumped the queue there, because you're right. I think his energy and tenacity and intensity suits Amorim's system down to the ground, and might see him jump the queue. And I mean, do you look at repurposing one of those players as potentially a wing back just to try and get more of them in the team? Because I think this has been the one discussion point around Amorim, hasn't it? That maybe the he plays at the moment doesn't suit the players the United have got, in that I don't see any obvious wing backs, and you potentially put in 2 of Garnacho, Rashford and Amad on the bench at the moment.
It was, 7 years ago or so, 8 years ago, I suppose, in fact, that when the season started. But the Chelsea model in Antonio Conte's first season is still relevant here, because they played a 3-4-3 or a 3-4-2-1, however way you want to look at it. And they did not have Eden Hazard as one of the 2 wide players in that midfield 4. They had a fullback in Marcus Alonso, and they had a winger in Victor Moses. And I think that's what Amorim should do at United. You don't want to be too conservative. You can't be too gung-ho. You've got to find that balance there. And I think logically the way of trialing that balance, and there will be a form of trial and error, absolutely, is to have a fullback on one side and a winger on the other, or an attacker in the case of Amad. And I think Amad on one side and Mazraoui on the other is what would be my preference. I think it's a debate that will throw up a whole raft of suggested solutions, because it's, a lot of people have different thoughts on it. They will think that the wingers should adapt, but I look at Garnacho and Rashford, and they do not strike me remotely as players who should be playing in that midfield 4, because you have to track back, and of course they are going to have to track back anyway. But as a starting point, you need to sometimes err on the side of caution. That's why I would not want two fullbacks on those 2 sides, because you don't want to restrict yourself. You want to get the balance right between attack and defence, but you can't be too gung-ho and risk leaving your defenders exposed. And Tottenham, in 2 victories at Old Trafford by a 6-1 margin and winning 3-0 most recently, one of the reasons why they won those games, part of their tactic, was to attack United down the flanks, because they know that United's wingers don't like to track back and don't like to defend. And in both those games, Marcus Rashford started. And Marcus Rashford is now 27. If he's going to change and become a much more, not defensive-minded, but certainly if he's going to muck in now at this age, and if Amorim's going to get him to do that, that will be a huge success for Amorim, because he's not shown any inclination to do that for the majority of his professional career so far. And he's been playing professional football for nearly 9 years. And Garnacho has got a long way to go in doing that. There is time. He's got time on his side. I think you can do that with him. He just needs to... There was the clip at the weekend, wasn't there, where he started jogging back, really, against Pedro Neto, I think it was, and Casemiro was busting a gut to get back. And one thing you would say about Casemiro is, for all his shortcomings, he does not lack commitment. He's been useless at times for United over the past year in games, but it's not been through a lack of commitment. And after he got back to, I can't remember if he got a tackle in on Neto or if he fouled him, but his immediate instinct was to have a pop at Garnacho, and he was quite right to have a pop at him, because he wasn't busting a gut to get back. And we have seen Garnacho do it. We have seen him muck in, but you've got to do that consistently. And he's not at that level yet, but despite his recent performances, he is a player that you absolutely want starting in your team if you're a United fan, or if you're Amorim. And I would certainly be looking to have him as one of the 2 behind the striker. The other one one of them has to be Fernandes. This whole thing of, someone misses out, boo-hoo, who cares? They're not entitled to start every game. United have got loads of games this season. There will have to be an element of rotation. You do need options. You're going to have to rest players at times. You're going to have to drop players at times and give another player a chance. I mean, Ahmad came into the team last night. A lot of people would have seen that as rotation because Rashford was training individually at the start of Wednesday's session. Maybe Rashford was dropped. It's a pity for Ahmad that he got injured because we don't know whether he'll be fit for Sunday. But if he is, it'll be interesting to see if he keeps his place, because he certainly should keep his place. I think he said to you guys in the mix zone that he was fine afterwards. So hopefully that is the case. And then he can have another go in a bigger and certainly more testing game. But that front three, it's not like it should be set in stone there. There's an argument to say that it shouldn't be Højlund or Xerxes up front. There's an argument to trial Rashford as a striker in a different formation. And I know it may not work because Rashford is not a striker, but he's certainly not going to be your left winger, or he shouldn't be your left winger as far as I'm concerned. And I think the other night, watching Sporting and particularly the lad who played on the right that United have some interest in, Giovanni Kenda, who's only 17, he put an absolute shift in, and he put a brilliant ball through for Gyökeres to score the first goal. I think it was his pass through. And that's what, if a 17-year-old has the tactical initiative and just understands that he's got to run in both directions, contribute as much in defence and as much in attack, then there's no reason why someone 10 years older shouldn't be able to do it in Rashford. But he's never done that. He's never done that in his career, and maybe he will change. And Rashford certainly does have form with permanent managers of really having a strong start under them, whether it was getting his career break under Van Gaal, whether it was at the start of Mourinho's reign when he played really well. Under Solskjaer, he was brilliant. I think he scored the first goal under Solskjaer at Cardiff, didn't he? And he certainly had a terrific time of it under Ten Hag in that first season. So I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if Marcus Rashford sets the world alight playing under Ruben Amorim for United. But there is a case to be made that if he is to start, it has to be as one of those three. And I wouldn't necessarily be against him, Garnacho and Fernandes occupying those three spots, because the two strikers at the moment are pretty damn hopeless for a variety of reasons. And Højlund quietly has only got 2 goals in 11 games this season. Xerxes, his ratio got worse last night just by having a 5-minute cameo, where he's now got 1 goal in 16 games, I think it is. And really, Rashford is actually on his days, he's a more dependable goal scorer than those two. So there is an argument to say, and I'm sure a lot of fans will be against it because they'll feel as though he's had his chance and he should be consigned to a bench warming role. But there would definitely be logic in trying him at the apex of that attack, and maybe you can rotate it. Fernandes can play up top there at times during the game. Garnacho can do it at times. It will take a lot of work to get that right, and also having the support of the wide players. But certainly come that Ipswich game 2 weeks on Sunday, I think it's wise that the forwards, certainly the more senior forwards in terms of appearances for United, they occupy those positions in that attacking triangle. And as for the wide position, I think Ahmad is the most suitable one to give it a go. But there would, of course, be an element of risk because he's hardly played on the left for United. I mean, he could play on the right. You could have him on the right and Mazraoui on the left. But it'd be understandable if Amorim erred on the side of caution and played Mazraoui and Diallo in those 2 wide roles. But there has to be a temptation to try and get that balance right. And I go back to the Alonso Moses experiment. Well, it wasn't an experiment; it was the setup that Chelsea had when they only lost 5 league games all season. They won the title, and that team barely changed throughout the course of the season after Conte settled on that on that side, and it did help them that they didn't have any European football to play as well. So the players were fresher than they would be in a normal campaign for Chelsea, where they get to the latter stages of a European competition. But it's still a relevant example as much as football has evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think given that those wing backs seem to provide the width in Amorim's system, I think you're going to want a right footer on the right and a left footer on the left. So, maybe that does suggest the left wing back role is the one that is up for grabs at the moment and could suit Ahmad. Right, that's all for the first part of the podcast. We'll be back after this break to look ahead to Leicester and Van Nistelrooy's farewell. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. The game's coming thick and fast at the moment, although we have an international break again after this weekend. This will be Ruud van Nistelrooy's fourth and final game in interim charge. It's only 10 days, I think it's 10 days, since Erik ten Hag was sacked, 10 or 11 days, which seems incredible. Someone asked me on Wednesday, I think it was, at open training, was it last week ten Hag was sacked? And I was thinking, it can't be last week. It feels like it's longer ago than that. And you're like, God, it was, yeah. only last Monday. It feels like an awful long time ago compared to everything that's happened recently. And like I say, it's been, this has been a very strange holding pattern. The whole recruiting Amorim and then letting him stay at Sporting for another couple of weeks is kind of unprecedented at this level. But Van Nistelrooy has done a pretty solid job. And I was saying to a couple of people last night, I mean, if he wins on Sunday, and you'd have to think United can have too much for Leicester, if he comes away from this period with 3 wins and a draw from 4 games, then I think you've got to say it's a job well done, haven't you?
Yes, he'll have. I suppose the other way of looking at it is that he'll have won the games that he was expected to win, and he didn't win the game that not many expected United to win, but it's still a pretty good return in the circumstances, where he's also, as I've said before previous podcasts, he's conducted himself brilliantly in press conferences with the media. He's very personable. He's very urbane. He talks a good game. He's been loved by the supporters for the best part of 25 years at United. And what I liked about him last night as well, shortly after Ahmad scored, he milked the occasion. He celebrated with some supporters in that in the corner, and he was kissing the badge. And after the restart, he was wandering around a bit in the centre, and Van Nistelrooy was on his case saying, "You need to come back over here. You play on the right. You don't play where Højlund plays." And he wasn't resting on his laurels. He wasn't going to just let a player off the hook just because he'd got a goal. And Van Nistelrooy looked more delighted than anyone else in the stadium that Ahmad had scored. So I think whoever appoints him as a manager will be getting a really good choice. He's done himself no harm whatsoever in terms of his career going forward. I think there was some slight surprise that he opted to go back to United as an assistant coach, although he must have had an inkling that there was an opportunity to manage them as an interim or in a permanent capacity. I think United did the right thing in absolutely not considering him as a permanent option for a single second. I think that would have been a mistake. This was someone who had discussions with a championship club, Burnley, about managing them in the summer. It would have been a mistake to have suddenly thought he was the right man or worthy of consideration for the manager's role at United. And United have done the right thing, having a clean break and going for a very exciting choice in Amorim. And if Van Nistelrooy goes, there'll be an awful lot of disappointment among the supporters, but I think there'll also be a lot of disappointment in the dressing room. Players have spoken on the record, and doing our own bit of digging, it's pretty clear that Van Nistelrooy has gone down a storm in there, and they've been really impressed by how he's taken charge of things, steadied the ship. He's clearly a very good man manager. He's always been a very warm presence, whether you're interviewing him, asking him a question in press conferences, how he engages with supporters. That there is that warmth that he just exudes that Ten Hag never did exude. And I think it's not a coincidence that someone like Ahmad, who probably not jarred at times with Ten Hag, but he is someone who does need an arm around the shoulder every now and then. He's thrived under Van Nistelrooy, and did particularly so last night. So the big decision that surrounding Van Nistelrooy is whether Amorim keeps him on. I think if he does and if he doesn't, you can understand either way. I don't think you can criticise Amorim if he does decide to keep Van Nistelrooy around the place, or whether he decides that he just wants faces that are completely familiar to him, and that means Van Nistelrooy, Yeliten Ruvela, René Hake, Darren Fletcher. If they all have to go, then so be it. I think that those four men are grown up and experienced enough to know that that's how it works in football. But there would be also merit in keeping on Van Nistelrooy, in that he does have an established relationship with the players in the dressing room. He could be a good conduit between Amorim and portions of the dressing room, or certain players. It was noticeable during pre-season that he was conversing quite a lot with Casemiro, because they're both fluent Spanish speakers, and there's definitely been a bump up in performance from Casemiro since Van Nistelrooy came in, and that's not a bad reflection on Casemiro whatsoever, because in Ten Hag's final match in charge, he was United's best player on the pitch. He got their equaliser, and he generally played quite well at West Ham. So there were definitely, I think personally, I think we'd probably both like to see him stick around, just because he's a good bloke, and I'm not saying that someone should stick around just because they're a good guy and everyone likes them and everyone gets on with him. But there would be merit in just having someone around, even if it's just that he sticks around until the end of the season, or until an opportunity arises to manage club elsewhere that appeals to him, because his assistant contract runs until 2026. Whether he sticks around for the start of Amorim's tenure, I think if that were to be the case, it would still be a surprise if he saw out his contract until the summer of 2026. And he's given short shrift to questions that have been asked about, has he spoken to Amorim? I mean, two people from the same organisation on two separate days pretty much asked him the same questions about whether he'd spoken to Amorim. It's pretty obvious that Amorim has a game to manage with Sporting on Sunday. He starts at United on Monday. He will not talk with Van Nistelrooy until next week at the earliest. That was apparent last week when we were speaking to Van Nistelrooy, and after the United announced that Amorim was going to start on November the 11th. So Van Nistelrooy's ploughed on. He's made the odd tweak. There's a press conference today when ordinarily there would not be a press conference ahead of a Sunday match when United have played on a Thursday night. Those games, almost always the pre-match press conference is conducted post-match on the Thursday. So he's stamped his mark, even in terms of just dictating a press conference time, which may, in the grand scheme of things, is quite minor, but it does show how seriously he's taken these 11 days that he's been in the role so far.
I mean, a lot is going to depend on what sort of role Amorim can find for him, I guess. I mean, he's been an assistant to Ten Hag, and his title is assistant manager. We know that Amorim wants to bring a fair few staff with him, and it's how Van Nistelrooy is going to fit into that. I mean, in terms of that current setup, I can see Fletcher staying just because he provides that link with the academy. Beyond that, it's all a bit uncertain. I mean, like you say, it feels like the decisions are only going to be finalised next week. I know United said that they're not expecting any confirmation on staff this week. I mean, the last time United had an interim manager, he left the club pretty much on the final whistle of his final game in Michael Carrick. It doesn't feel like that's going to happen with Van Nistelrooy, but in a way, if that is...
Forgetting Ralph Rangnick there.
Well, yes, I suppose he was a caretaker manager then, should we go with, rather than an interim. I can't remember exactly what Carrick's title was, but... I
think interim came into football with, was it Rafael Benitez at Chelsea? I think that's the first time I'd heard it used by a football club, an interim manager.
We've been referring to Van Nistelrooy as interim, but it feels like interim maybe needs to be longer.
Caretaker, isn't it? Yeah.
There should be a limit between caretaker and interim. You know, for a certain number of games to be considered interim. So let's go with caretaker for Carrick and Van Nistelrooy. And obviously it was announced, I think it was it Arsenal at home, the Carrick game, and they announced on the final whistle that he was going. doesn't feel like that's going to happen on Sunday. But in a way, it would be nice to have clarity, because the fans still love Van Nistelrooy, and it's been very clear from watching him on the touchline these last 3 games what this club still means to him, hasn't it? He's been very expressive, even when he comes out of the tunnel, and his interaction with fans. His interaction with fans last Wednesday after the Carabao Cup game, when he stood in front of the Stretford end clapping for quite a while. It's clear what this club means to him, and in a way, it would be a bit of a shame if it got to next week and you know, he spoke to Amorim and they decided there wasn't a role for him, and he kind of leaves quietly. It'd be nicer for him to have a grander farewell, I guess, if at all possible.
It was pretty obvious, even after the Leicester game, during the Leicester game last week, that he was really savouring that moment. His walk-off after full time, it felt like it was almost his final game managing United then, even though he was certain to have 3 more matches in charge. Maybe he didn't know for certain at that time, because Amorim still wasn't official, but the assumption was that he would probably have the rest of the games before the November internationals, and his body language will be interesting after full time on Sunday against Leicester again. I can imagine that he will savour the moment in front of the Stretford end once more, and the vast majority of supporters inside the ground, unless United are getting walloped 3-0, but the vast majority of them will be still in their seats, and they'll be on their feet at full time to show their appreciation for Van Nistelrooy, because they will not know whether he'll be there for the next home game against, I think it's Bodo Glimt in the Europa League. So that's just under 3 weeks off now. So it's a fair way off until United next play at Old Trafford. And his popularity was easy to gauge even when he was the assistant to Ten Hag. He's been serenaded several times this season after games. He was almost deliberately the last to acknowledge the away supporters. So their playlist for matches ended with Van Nistelrooy's chant. They've added Karma Chameleon to the Old Trafford playlist in recent games, because United sing Van Nistelrooy's name to that tune. He's a club great. I'd always have hesitated to say he's a club legend, just because, unfortunately for him, his 5 years at United were not trophy laden. They only won 1 title, and they won the FA Cup and the League Cup, which by modern Man United standards is a roaring success. But back then it was seen as a relative failure. But his popularity has soared during this period, and he's been introduced to a new generation of supporters. I mean, he left in 2006, so he was away, if you like, for 18 years, which is a hell of a long time. And you'll have 18-year-olds who were born in the year that he was sold to Real Madrid, becoming familiar with what a great player Van Nistelrooy was and why he was revered so much. And the great thing is they can just go on YouTube and literally watch all of his goals and see how great he was and how much he meant to United supporters when he was in his playing pomp. And of course he will probably field the questions that he fielded last night and on Wednesday and last week, this Sunday as well. But he doesn't get tired with it. He would be entitled to give some of those questions short shrift, because he's already answered them, and it can be frustrating for us just to hear such repetitive questions. But the guy's just a class act. He always has been. When years ago when I interviewed him in Marbella, harking back to that again, the PR I was with was a huge Arsenal fan. But he wanted a picture with Van Nistelrooy as well, despite Van Nistelrooy's, Van Nistelrooy and Arsenal fans were not exactly a match made in heaven, shall we say, because of the Battle of Old Trafford in 2003, and then the following year, pre-Battle of the Buffet, he went in on Ashley Cole, avoided a red card, and then he stuck the penalty away to end Arsenal's unbeaten run in the Premier League. But the PR was just kind of in awe of Van Nistelrooy because of how he is with people. And I remember that night he was doing some online Q&A, and he was asked who would be your first guest at a dinner party, and he said Arsene Wenger. And Wenger spoke very unkindly about Van Nistelrooy calling him a cheat that time after Patrick Vieira got sent off in that infamous game in 2003. But that's Van Nistelrooy. He has always been a class act ever since he was introduced at Old Trafford all those years ago. So I think I would certainly not be the only one who would be sorry to see him go. But I would completely understand if Amorim decides that you're not for me, and these are the reasons, and this is why we need a completely clean break.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the current United manager to the next, I was going to say the next one, but the first head coach in United's history. I think you and Steven did the podcast on Monday, at which point there was obviously a buzz around Ruben Amorim. It's fair to say that went up several notches on Tuesday night. I did mischievously say in my piece from the game last night that this was only United's second best result in Europe this week. I mean, the Sporting's evisceration of Manchester City was just about the perfect night for Sporting, for United, for social media, United fans. It was quite the statement, wasn't it? It was quite the performance. And, you know, I went to open training on Wednesday morning, and it was all anyone was really talking about around Carrington. There was a question to Andre Onana over whether he'd watched the game, which he had. And, you know, I think it was one of those where everyone involved or connected to United was going to watch it. And you can see why. Someone did say to me, it's very similar to how Ole Gunnar Solskjaer used to set up against City, which I can kind of see the point in that it was, Amorim almost said it afterwards, and that it was defensive. You know, he said we can't play that way at United because it was basically defensive and playing on the break. But, I mean, Solskjaer did that against City fairly effectively for United. But it was a statement performance, wasn't it? And it certainly added to the excitement levels around what is to come.
I think it was a tad more vibrant than those wins under Solskjaer. In fairness, like Solskjaer, what was it? He did beat City twice with a back three, albeit in one of them they needed to win by more than one goal because they went out of the League Cup at the semi-final stage. But there was it was quite interesting because the camera cut to Amorim very, very quickly after Sporting scored a couple of times, and he was very measured in his celebrations. And you half wondered whether he thought, oh God, like we could really do with not winning as compellingly as this. This is going to give me more on my plate. This is going to raise expectations. It might have actually helped him had Haaland converted that penalty and City made it 3-3, and then it ends in an entertaining draw, and you see, you know, what you're going to get. But now the expectations have rocketed because Sporting are one of 4 clubs to have put 4 goals past Guardiola's City, and it's quite an eclectic list. You've got Barcelona, of course, and then it's Leicester and Everton. I think those three results all came in Guardiola's first season as well, which was very much a trial and error first season at City, where they didn't win anything. They finished third, or I think it was fourth they finished, wasn't it? Because Chelsea won the title, Tottenham came second, I think Liverpool may have come third that season. So it was a third or fourth place finish from City and no trophies. And then, of course, they embarked on their period of dominance under Guardiola. So absolutely no mean feat whatsoever. There was a lot of mitigation behind that result. City were excellent in the first half and could easily have been further ahead before Gyökeres equalised. Sporting absolutely came flying out the traps in the second half, and City didn't really know what had hit them. And I suppose if you're looking at it from a City perspective, they were the architects of their own downfall, and that they gave away 2 penalties and they missed a penalty as well. Although it was quite, I think they were quite fortunate to get that penalty there. It was, again, UEFA slowing it, slow-mo replay, completely taking a handball out of context. But I think in terms of what I was told how Amorim would operate, depth to strikers, depth to wingers, you absolutely saw that. Not much of a passing game, which I don't think is a bad thing. There will be times where that could harm United, and they may have to, and he may have to incorporate that into their style in England. But they were also quite compact without the ball. They would, it would be a low block, as hipsters call it. going to a 4-5-1 or a 5-4-1, and they were pretty resolute in that second half. The first half, I thought they were far too porous, and it didn't help that they had a goalkeeper who was a hologram for the first goal. It annoys me at times when commentators say, "Oh, maybe there was some swerve on that ball," which I think what Ali McCoy said. It's like, no, it wasn't. The ball was hit straight at him, and he foolishly thought it was going to go to his left, and in the end, it just went straight through where his body should have been. But there was a lot to like about that sporting performance, as I said earlier, about the kid on the left wing who United are looking at, Giovanni Kenda, who only made his debut in August and is already he's 17. He's already starting regularly in a very crowd pleasing and vibrant Sporting side. And as I said, running forwards, running backwards. It was a piercing pass for Gyökeres as his first goal. There was a lot to like about it, and if you were a United fan, you would have been absolutely lapping up that victory, and rightly so. They can. It's not been often that United fans have got giddy in recent years, so they're entitled to be quite giddy after that. But they may want to brace themselves for a bit of a culture shock when Amorim comes in, and if they're not winning every game 4-1, it's not going to be quite that simple and straightforward, one suspects.
Absolutely, yeah. It might not be like that at Portman Road on his first game in charge, but we will see. A very good week for United so far then. Van Nistelrooy will look to round it off against Leicester on Sunday. We'll be back probably on Monday, early next week, to discuss that game and look ahead to the official start of the Ruben Amorim era. But for now, that is everything. Please leave us a like. Remember to subscribe. Give us a review if you've enjoyed the podcast, and we'll speak to you all on Monday.